The successors of Proudhon in France, Togliatti and his Italian acolytes long ago carried out the theoretical elaboration of the roads to the new socialist society which the Eurocommunists advocate. At present, however, it is the French revisionists who are making megalomaniacal philosophical speeches, who are trying to make up for lost time and emerge as the banner-bearers of Eurocommunism, as those who interpret and state its laws. This role they have undertaken makes them ridiculous and exposes them even more in the eyes of the working class of their own country and the working people of the whole world. Georges Marchais has become a zealous follower of the theories of Roger Girardi, who made the law ideologically in the French Communist Party in the time of Thérèse and who was expelled from that party later. Girardi strove to prove that in the developed capitalist countries the proletariat allegedly no longer exists, that it has been put on the same level as the working people of the administration, the engineers and technicians who, according to Girardi, are all equally exploited. Now Georges Marchais has taken over this theory as his own and has carried it even further. According to him, everyone, not only the working class, not only all the working people, but even the bourgeoisie, and indeed the army and police, are allegedly for the socialism which he preaches. In his discourses he says repeatedly, "We want to advance to socialism, but we are hindered by just 25 families, which comprise the strength of capital in France. How is it possible that we, all this force, should not be able to have our say and overcome this caste which remains in power?" wonders Marchais. And he provides his own answer, that to advance to socialism France requires only economic and political reforms. He deals with the question of overthrowing capital as something which can be easily achieved, just with a few words, by puffing out one's cheeks and blowing it over. Whatever else it may be, the road which the French revisionists advocate can be anything, but it has nothing at all to do with the genuine road to socialism. Marchais compares and equates the present representatives of state power in France with the French aristocracy before the time of the triumph of the bourgeoisie, 2 centuries ago, and refers to its leaders as these princes who govern us. However, the French revisionists are not even in the positions of those people who carried out the French bourgeois revolution of 1789. It is known that this revolution cut off the heads of the king and the queen, and of all those princes who governed France at that time. The progressive bourgeoisie of that period, which overthrew the monarchy and feudalism, did not stop at that, but carried the revolution further by cutting the heads of all the leaders of the reactionary factions of the bourgeoisie which were emerging, the Feuillants, the Vigneaud's and Dantons. This revolution reached its culmination in the dictatorship of the Jacobins led by Robespierre, whom bourgeois reaction sent to the guillotine. Marchais describes Prince Poniatowski, Giscard d'Estaing's former Minister of the Interior, as a Versaillese. However, he forgets the Commune of Paris, which fought with arms against Thiers and the Versaillese. The Communards stormed the heaven, said Marx, while Marchais, with his revisionist theories, wages against the Poniatowskis one guerre en dentelles. The leaders of the French revisionist party try to explain the underlying reasons for the decline of France. The theses for the 23rd Congress of the French Communist Party say, since 1976, inflation practically stands at a high level. unemployment has increased about 30%. The buying power of the working people has declined. Economic growth has ceased. Austerity, unemployment and the super-exploitation of the working people are accompanied with an increase in the capitalists' profits. In France, which is a multi-branched industrial economy, whole branches, such as iron steel, shipbuilding, machine building, textile, footwear, etc., are being ruined today. The number of workers employed in industry has fallen by more than 500,000. These things about the situation in France are known. The problem is not to observe the grave situation of the economy and the workers in France, but how to change this situation. Marx did not restrict himself merely to making his diagnosis of capitalist society, but also defined the road to overthrow it. The modern revisionists have abandoned this scientific road and only prattle to deceive the party and the working class that they are allegedly concerned about its situation. The French revisionists also speak about the grave crisis which the capitalist world is experiencing today. The present crisis of the capitalist countries is an international crisis, says Georges Marchais. It is in the final analysis a crisis of the system of exploitation, domination and plunder of the workers and the peoples. Very good, but how does he intend to utilize this key moment, which not only France, but the whole world is experiencing? With what kind of struggle? With class struggle, or with discourses? Does he hope that with his speeches he will liquidate the French monopoly bourgeoisie which oppresses the proletariat and working people of France with all that army and police force which Marchais thinks he has on his side? No, he indulges in demagogy which is meant, on the one hand, for the gallery and on the other, to tranquilize the employers. Such revisionists base themselves on the pseudo-theories which they have concocted themselves, according to which the situation has now allegedly matured to the point that there is no longer any need for the revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat in order to build the new socialist society. Now, according to them, every class in society, indeed every individual, thinks as a socialist. For them, socialism has become so deeply implanted in the consciousness of man that it has become part and parcel of his consciousness. The resolution adopted by the 23rd Congress of the French Communist Party says, socialism is already being realized, and moreover, being realized in a great diversity of forms. The purpose of these pseudo-theories is to tell the workers that what Lenin did through revolution and bloodshed has now been achieved, moreover under the savage oppression of capital, without revolution and without violence. The revisionist leaders of the French Communist Party are trying to convince the workers that in the existing society of France, Europe and the world, man has managed to understand that industrial society is no longer a society based on capitalist profit. This is an utterly false theory, because monopoly capital which prevails in this society demands not merely profits, but maximum profits. Georges Marchais also speaks about the export of capital, but he does not say that this export is a means of barbarous exploitation, not only of the workers of the metropolises, but also of the workers of the backward or developing countries. Today the export of capital has become a fundamental feature of neocolonialism. Georges Marchais goes so far as to claim that in the existing situation, imperialism is obliged to seek new international solutions which correspond to the needs of the peoples. How humanitarian this imperialism has become that acts according to the needs of the peoples. However, imperialism remains imperialism and is not changed with the words and analyses of sophists. By preaching such stuff, the French Eurocommunist revisionists are simply assisting imperialism by prettifying it, by spreading and nurturing the illusion that it desires to remake a new world. In a long tirade, at the 22nd Congress of the FCP, Marchais goes so far as to say that the accusation of allegedly wanting to eliminate the wealthy, levelled against the French revisionists, is without foundation. Considering it a slander, he declares openly that they want private property to exist, want the middle bourgeoisie to exist with all its property, and want the landed peasantry to exist, that they want only to nationalize all the common state assets and to have all these administered by the people. Social democracy also defends these capitalist structures which Marchais defends. In this instance he has the right to be angry with those who accuse him of not being 100% loyal to the bourgeoisie like his social democratic brothers. At the beginning of 1979, Georges Marchais wrote, "We want a social democracy, an economic democracy, a political democracy, and we wish to go further, to a radical transformation of social relations so that we can make it possible for the French people to live in a democratic self-administrative socialism." El Humanité. Thus, Marchais emerges as a follower of Tito, who has implemented in Yugoslavia precisely the anarcho-syndicalist theories of Proudhon and Bakunin on workers' self-administration, which Marx and later Lenin sternly condemned. Now Georges Marchais, under the cloak of creative Marxism but never deigning to use any of the statements of the great teachers of Marxism, does not dare to defend the anti-Marxist views of Proudhon openly and say that he is his disciple. However, in demanding self-administration, he simply is changing the terms while he carries on the petty bourgeois theory of Proudhon. The leaders of the French Communist Party speak a great deal about wages and raise the problem of the reformist struggle for raising them. The buying power of the workers and their families must be increased by giving more to those who get the least, they say. The measures to minimize the inequalities in incomes as well as in bonuses must be increased. The range of wage differentials must be reduced by raising the lower wages. The revisionists raise these problems because at the present time increased pay is a universal demand of the masses. Georges Marchais asks in amazement how the phenomenon can exist that workers and the elderly do not have the possibility to live properly, do not have the right to speak on the radio and television. They must win all these things, he says. My party has fought and is fighting to increase wages, to reduce taxes, to ensure that Parliament will no longer be as it is at present, with intolerable conditions imposed on its functioning and its prerogatives restricted, says he. While restricting the struggle of the working class simply to day-to-day demands, the French revisionists neglect the teachings of Marx, who has explained that in a disguised way, wages hide the exploitation of the workers by the capitalists who appropriate part of the labor, precisely the unpaid labor of the workers, which creates surplus value for the capitalist. They deliberately say nothing about the idea of Marx, who says that the solution to the problem does not lie in raising wages, or in equalizing them, as Proudhon, that classic reformists, believed. Marx said that to restrict the struggle of the working class merely to wages was nothing but an attempt to prolong the existence of wage slavery. The final elimination of the exploitation of wage laborers, says Marx, is the only correct and radical solution to the problem. The French revisionists leave in obscurity Marx's theory about the social character of production and the capitalist, private character of the means of production in capitalism and the relations of production between classes. They deliberately do not mention the fact that these questions involve the interests of different classes which are constantly in struggle with one another to alter the character of ownership. They deal with these problems in general terms, simply as economic questions, just as the theoreticians of economism did. Their theory is not the theory of Marx, but the theory of deviators who came after Marx. Marx reduces the mission and the struggle of the proletariat to a struggle for economic rights and not for the overthrow of the power of capital. In the manifesto of the Communist Party, Marx issued the call, "Workers of all countries, unite." But why? To carry out the revolution. While Marx says, "Workers, peasants, bourgeois, police, soldiers and officers, unite." To carry reforms. The notion proletariat is considered by the French revisionists to be a romantic notion about which to create poetry. Instead of fighting to ensure that the proletariat is in the forefront of the revolution and in close alliance with the working people of town and countryside, the French revisionists try to unite it in another historic bloc, in a union of the left, as the French revisionists call their collaboration with the bourgeois parties, or in the historic compromise, as the Italian revisionists call such a thing. The French revisionists promote this theory on alliances on the basis of their view that in the present-day capitalist order, the workers every day see that the conditions of life are improving and that the proletariat, in the true meaning of the term, is disappearing. This is the thesis of the revisionist Giraudy, whom the French revisionists keep outside the party in vain. Whether he is inside or outside it, it is all the same so long as the revisionist leaders of the French Communist Party agree that the bourgeois parties should join them in the dance in order to go to socialism. That is where Giraudy and company vegetate, too. The French revisionist leadership criticized and expelled Giraudy from the party, not proceeding from principled positions, but because he came out prematurely with and raised the banner of the new line, something which, according to rank, was up to Marx and other leaders more senior than he. This leadership is acting in the same way today with Ellenstein and Althusser, who want to proceed more quickly on the revisionist road. However, there is no doubt at all that the leadership of the French Communist Party will quickly come to terms and unite, not only with Giraudy and Ellenstein, but also with Mitterrand, Ricard and all the Social Democrats. Whether they will pass first through a union of the left, a joint program, or through some other form is of no importance. Since they have the same views and aims, everything else will come about automatically. The revisionists in general, and the French ones in particular in their theories, are opposed to the management of the economy by the state in socialism. Marx says, We're fighting today against authoritarianism and suffocating centralism. On the contrary, we want the state enterprises to be autonomous in their administration. We want the working people, the workers, the clerks, the engineers and the cadres to take part more and more actively in this administration. We also want the communes, districts and regions to become real centers for decision-making and democratic administration. These views of revisionists in the French Communist Party are totally in accord with the line of Yugoslav self-administration and the federalism of Proudhon, who said, there should be only an industrial democracy, a positive anarchy. Whoever speaks of freedom speaks of federalism, or says nothing. Whoever speaks of republic, speaks of federalism, or says nothing. Whoever speaks of socialism, speaks of federalism, or says nothing. Hence for Proudhon, the federal principle is applied in the economy and in politics. Perhaps Georges Marchais does not describe these questions in the terms which Proudhon used, but when he speaks of his democratic socialism, he says, "I want a fine society, with justice, freedom, etc., and asks whether it is reasonable that the workers should be suppressed for these simple aspirations, and that these aspirations should remain only a dream." Proudhon demanded democracy and freedom, and according to him, these could be won very easily, could be taken from the hands of the capitalists without any trouble. Marchais does not restrict himself merely to this, but stresses that the workers in bourgeois democracy had greater freedom 200 years ago. They took part in the affairs of the state in the factories, and finally, he is indignant that they do not have these freedoms today. However, he goes no further than indignation. And Marchais goes no further, because he does not want to do battle with the capitalists, but wants to coexist with them in peace. All this is like a fairy tale for the Gogos. Marchais preaches that even in the conditions of the existence of the capitalist order, by means of reforms it can be brought about that the proletariat takes part in the management of the economy. He dreams and says that within this order there can be a social democracy in which all the workers, without exception, can benefit from wealth, that there can be a political democracy in which every citizen can control, manage, and truly be in the leadership, in other words self-administration. Is this not completely the theory of Proudhon? In connection with the democratic socialism advocates, Marchais also deals with the question of property and the planned running of the economy. He divides property in this society into state and private property, but the property which he leaves to private owners is colossal. With this he wants to tell the ruling bourgeoisie, don't accuse us French revisionists in vain. Because we respect private property, we are not for the proletarian revolution, we are no longer for raising the fist, but for holding out the hand of friendship. Marchais speaks about municipal, departmental, regional property. He does not use Proudhon's term federalism, but it amounts to the same thing. When Marchais says, we fight against authoritarianism and suffocating centralism, he implies the struggle against democratic centralism, contrary to the teachings of Marx, Engels, Lenin and Stalin. And he stresses, we must build up the plan in a democratic way, ensuring that not only the workers and other working people, but also those who have property will take part. Marches notes that the planning of the economy is not a method which can be applied in any social system depending on the goodwill of those who are in the leadership of the country. Unified central planning becomes possible only where complete social ownership has been established over the means of production, and this is characteristic only of socialism. Private property, in whatever form, has not submitted and never will submit to centralized planning. These are objective truths, and they cannot change just because this would please Marches and other Eurocommunist theoreticians. Modern revisionism, not only in France but in all capitalist revisionist countries, is also attacking Marxism-Leninism in the field of literature and the arts, because it wants to use them as means to poison the minds of people and make them degenerate. The revisionist writers, poets and artists have taken the road of bourgeois degeneration. Today it is difficult to distinguish an Aragon from a Beauvoir and an André Stille from a Sagan. This is not referring to a similarity in style and form, but to an identity in the content and purpose of their works which are inspired by anti-Marxist philosophical trends, in order to emerge on the same course, to fight the revolution, to tame the spirits, to make them dead spirits, equally degenerate. Or the revisionist Theotians advocate the thesis that Marx and Engels allegedly gave very little attention, if any at all, to aesthetics. The aesthetes of the French Communist Party go even further. They try to prove that Marx was allegedly not interested at all in art or did not understand it. Contrary to the facts, they allege that Marx was unable to understand what it was that gave art an everlasting value irrespective of the historical moments, and was unable to understand how Greek art, linked with the infrastructure of that time, continues to arouse emotions. Such a distortion of Marx is not done without a purpose. On the one hand, they want to create the impression that there is no Marxist opinion about art, and that allegedly the revisionists are elaborating this, and, on the other hand, they are trying to deny the class character of art and to start discussion about whether art is part of the superstructure or the structure, whether or not it is an ideology, whether or not it is linked with the class and the revolution, to what degree and to what point, etc. A series of theoreticians of the French Communist Party have had different opinions about literature and art at different periods, and this has brought about confusion and chaos in the ranks of the party and its militants and vacillations in the creative literary and artistic work of communist writers and artists. At one period, the French Communist Party fought for that creative work which was based on the people's art, on revolutionary art, and later, on socialist realism. At a later stage anti-Marxist trends penetrated the creative work of communist artists. With its decadent art, the bourgeoisie exerted an influence not only on the rank-and-file members of the Communist Party, but also on the cadres engaged in agitation and propaganda. Influenced by this art, these elements propounded theories, gave distorted and incorrect interpretations of Lenin, who pointed out that the revolution creates its own art and that the communists do not reject the progressive heritage of the people from the past. These individuals also interpreted in bourgeois and revisionist ways the statements of Lenin, Stalin and Zdanov, that in socialist society the writers and artists should be free in their creative work, should have personal initiative, but always be realist and create works which truly serve the revolution and socialism. Certain pseudo-Marxist aesthetes went so far as to defend the thesis that Lenin had allegedly advocated absolute freedom in creative work. The anti-Marxist philosopher Girardi proclaimed unlimited realism. Others defend the thesis that when ideology and the party prevail in literature and art, there is no freedom and therefore no creative work. What else could one expect in the field of aesthetics, when such people as Ansix Gerd, Malraux or Paul Nizan had influence in the French Communist Party and posed as communists? Together with Aragon, they took part in the first Congress of the Soviet writers in Moscow, but in the end betrayed and became open anti-communists. Such theoreticians in France, inside and outside the Communist Party, could have no idea of the value of art based on the principles of Marxism-Leninism. The purpose of these elements was to separate art and literature from politics and ideology, of course, from proletarian politics and the Marxist ideology. They struggled to clear the way for the spread of bourgeois ideology and politics, for the development of decadent art, psychoanalyst, sexual, crime and pornographic novels, so that the markets, bookshops, showcases, theatres and cinemas would be filled with such works. Let us take Picasso. He was a member of the French Communist Party till he died, but he never became a Marxist. This is reflected in his works, while the French Communist Party boasted of him, and the only criticism which they made of him was for a scroll which was called Portrait of Stalin, and which his friend and comrade Aragon published in the newspaper Les Lettres Françaises, of which he was director. Socialist realism was not supported by the French Communist Party strongly and with conviction. Some of the writers, philosophers and critics who were party members, such as Marguerite Duras and Claude Roys, deserted. After Khrushchev's slanders against Stalin, the French Communist Party was shaken and such intellectuals were the first to capitulate. It launched the slogan of complete freedom in art and culture, and such former defenders of socialist realism as Aragon, André Still, and André Wams not only changed their coats, but even sold their souls and their hearts to revisionism. Thus the French pseudo-communist literary figures began to fall in love with the Lukácses, the Kafkas and the Sartres. Critical discussions began throughout the whole party on the platform which the bourgeoisie desired, such as, what is the relation between literature and ideology? What forms should be accepted in art, sectarianism in interpretation or opportunist eclecticism? Speaking as an authority, Roland Leroy pronounced the conclusion that there cannot be a specific form of proletarian art or art which is completely revolutionary. Wallowing in opportunism and revisionism, the French Communist Party allowed these anti-revolutionary theses to ooze like stagnant waters and become predominant amongst its creative artists. As a conclusion, we can say that the line of the French Communist Party in literature and art has had its ups and downs. But it has always been wobbly. Its vacillation has been caused by its orthodoxy in the preservation of principles, on the one hand, and by the direct and indirect influence of bourgeois ideology in literature and art amongst its intellectuals, on the other hand. In general, the intellectuals who worked in the field of artistic creativeness have played a role more negative than positive for the French Communist Party. Irrespective of their class origin, they completed their schooling and sought fame. The party never influenced and guided them with the proletarian ideology and culture. To these intellectuals of the party it was their free, subjective, individual, creative work, and never the true interests of the proletariat and the revolution, that was important. These elements lived and worked far removed from the working class and isolated from it. For them, the class was the economy, while the intellectuals were the godhead that had to guide the economic factor. The intellectuals of the French party had been raised and inspired in the Bohemia of Montparnasse, in Closerie des Lilas, Pavillon de Fleurs, Bateau Lavoie, and in other clubs in which all kinds of decadent trends came together, trends from which emerged the Aragons, the Picassos, the Elsa Triolets, and many other friends of the Lazarifs, the Tristan Zaras, the Dadaists, Cubists, and the 1001 decadent schools of literature and art. This tradition and this road continued uninterruptedly within the French Communist Party, until it arrived at its 22nd Congress, at which the revisionist Georges Marchais flaunted all the anti-Marxist corruption which had long been festering in the French Communist Party. At this Congress, the French revisionists came out officially against the leading role of the party of the working class in the field of art, and against the method of socialist realism. Underneath the pretext of the struggle against uniformity, they claimed that socialist culture should be open to all currents, to all kinds of experiments and creations. In the book which contains his report to the 22nd Congress, the pseudo-Marxist Georges Marchais published a poem by Aragon taken from his book Elsa's Madman. Elsa was Aragon's wife. Here is what Aragon, a member of the Central Committee of the French Communist Party, says in this verse: "Will there always be fighting and feuds, regal behavior and bowed heads? Children born of mothers unwanted, wheat destroyed by the locusts? Will there always be prisons and torture, always massacres in the name of idols? The idols are Marx, Engels, Lenin and Stalin, a mantle of words cast over the corpses, a gag in the mouth and nailed hands? But a day will come with orange colors." This is Aragon's way of saying that he and his party have abandoned the red color, communism. In this way, the French revisionists threw overboard the principles of the immortal theory of Marxism-Leninism. Now their party is floundering in a revisionism which is a mixture of the old utopian theories of Bernstein, Proudhon, Kautsky, and anarchism. Uniting with the ideology of other bourgeois parties, it is fighting to create the idea in France and elsewhere that Marxism has become obsolete, and Eurocommunism must come to the fore instead. In 1968, the students in Paris clashed with the forces of law and order. The Trotskyites, Sartre, the theoretician of existentialism, Simone de Beauvoir, Cohn-Bendit and others seized on to these clashes to give them an anarchist color. And in fact they took place in great disorder. The French Communist Party did not participate. Why did it not participate? Was it that in principle it was opposed to anarchism? I think this is not the reason. The reason is that it did not want to unite with the student youth, which was attacking the de Gaulle government. In fact, it was this movement which forced de Gaulle to hold the referendum, and when he did not win in the way he wanted, he retired to Colombes-les-Deux-Églises, where he died. the French Communist Party stopped the working class from going into action and taking over the leadership of the uprising. The party had the strength to ensure that the flames were spread throughout France, and if not to seize power, at least to shake the power of princes, or the power of barons, as they called it at that time. It did not do this, because it was for that road and for those methods which the petty bourgeois revisionist Georges Marchais advocates. The French Communist Party has great hopes in a coalition of the left, which it tried to create with the Socialist Party of Mitterrand in the elections for the President of France and in the parliamentary elections. The French Communist Party and the French Socialist Party reached a certain agreement, but this was temporary. Not only did they not win in the voting, but after the elections and the triumph of Giscard d'Estaing, it was seen that the love between the Communists and the Socialists was cooling, and indeed they began to attack one another. Neither the big bourgeoisie, nor its parties, nor even the Socialist Party of Mitterrand will ever want a Communist Party, even one of an orange colour, such as Aragon describes it, to take part in the government of France. This did not take place with the Popular Front, when our emblem was at the head of the Socialist Party, is not taking place today, when Mitterrand is at the head of the Socialist Party, and neither will it take place when someone else emerges at the head of it. The interests of the French capitalist bourgeoisie and of the 200 families, which Marchais has reduced to 25 in order to give the impression that today they are dealing with the small reactionary force, are closely linked together to protect their privileges, to protect their great possessions and capital, to increase their profits at the expense of the proletariat and all the working people of France. Of course, the Socialists have contradictions with the other parties of the bourgeoisie, but when it comes to the issue that the bourgeois power is threatened by the proletariat, then unity is achieved, not between the Communists and the Socialists, however, but between the Socialists and the bourgeoisie. This is occurring in Italy with the Socialist Party, which is uniting with the Christian Democrats, the Liberal Party and the Social Democratic Party, and is not making a common front even with Togliatti's communists. However, assuming for a moment that a cartel of the left in France could manage to take power, for the French communists, even with their orange colour, this would be ephemeral and would change nothing. Why is this? Because this is what happened when de Gaulle, in order to get out of his difficulties, accepted a few communists headed by Thérèse in the government, and threw them out again after he had used them as firemen. And when did he do this? He did this at a time when the French Communist Party had emerged from the Second World War with no small authority, as the only party which had fought the occupier consistently. Therefore, Marchais' pretensions that he is going to take power and build socialism now, with the Eurocommunist strategy, with the revisionist ideology of Proudhon and Bernstein, will never be realized. The most that the heads of the French Communist Party might achieve is to become shareholders in plundering the sweat and toil of the French proletariat and people, to strengthen the fire brigades of the counter-revolution, but nothing more.